good to go?
You're good to go.
All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Hank Rohr. For my Economics 384 project, I studied the effect of transit proximity and how that affects housing prices. So a brief outline of what I'll be talking about today. The background will state the question of this study and why it's of importance for planners and policymakers. The literature review will help guide me toward a location for this study and how previous studies have conducted their own research. The theoretical framework will then help develop a hypothesis as well as a model for looking at the effect of transit proximity on housing prices. Then the empirical framework will explain the variables that I'll be using in this study, as well as the predictions for this variable's effect on the sales price of a home. The data discussion will then explain the key sources where I collected my data from, and the results will then kind of get into whether or not my hypothesis was correct or not. Does proximity to light rail transit stations positively affect the value of single-family houses? Kind of spoiler alert, it does not. And then the counterfactual analysis will kind of explain the economic significance of this study. And finally, we'll wrap up with the conclusion and explain some of the problems. So kind of getting into the background, and the main question I was looking to answer was, how does proximity to light rail transit stations on the Metro Blue Line in Minneapolis affect the value of single-family houses during the years 2015 and 2016? So light rail transit is becoming increasingly more popular in the United States as it provides a relatively inexpensive mode of transportation while reducing emissions and decreasing congestion on our roads. And it's important from a policy perspective, as new light rail transit station or new light rail transit networks are being built. It's important to observe how house values are being affected, as changes in house prices may signal changes in land use, and we'll see that we'll see how this occurs in the following slides. So, kind of jumping into the literature review and kind of the basic theory of this study. Alonzo's bid rent theory is kind of the supply and demand for properties, and it asserts that as accessibility to a central business district increases, the demand for these locations rises. And this is due to the decreased transportation costs to either get to work, shopping centers, or just entertainment districts in general. And because of this increased demand in locations, we would expect the land values to experience premiums as a result. And then where we expect to see changes in land use is businesses and developers are all seeking to get in on this on these accessible locations, either to increase profits by getting more customers, or just to decrease their own transportation costs. And then where this phenomenon has occurred, where land values have changed and changes in development have occurred, is in Houston. In 2004, Houston created their own light rail transit network, and since then they have seen increases in land values as well as increases in economic development surrounding their light rail transit network. However, in Minneapolis, in a recent study by Hurst and West, they analyzed how economic development has changed surrounding the Metro Blue Line since its implementation since 2004, and they were not able to find the same results as the researchers in Houston did. So this kind of brings about the question whether or not land values have changed or whether or not land values have changed since the construction of the light rail in Minneapolis. So many researchers have kind of explored this relationship between transit proximity and housing prices, and they do this using a theory of hedonic pricing developed by Sherwin-Rosen. And he kind of derived this theory based off of Lancaster's new approach to consumer theory, which states that a consumer's utility is derived from the attributes of the goods inside of a consumption basket. And so Rosen kind of took this consumption basket and applied it to a house, where the consumption basket is the house, and the different attributes are things like the room count, the size of the house, maybe size of the yard, and possibly transit proximity. And it's important to note that the attributes are measured subjectively so that one individual may value that additional room more than another individual. So then kind of jumping to the theoretical framework, we're going to move back to bid rent theory. And here we have a brief illustration of the relationship between rental price and the distance from the central business district. On the x-axis, we have central business, the distance from the central business district, and at the origin is the business district itself, where the rental price is the greatest. And these are largely occupied by retailers and businesses who are really looking for these accessible locations to increase the profitability from customers. And as we move further away from the central business district, we start to see manufacturers who don't ultimately value the increase in customers. However, they are looking for that decreased transportation cost. And then finally, as we move the furthest away from the central business district, we start to see residential locations who are ultimately paying the lowest in rental price, however, but they are located the furthest away from the central business district. Then kind of moving on to the hedonic price models. On the x-axis, we have an attribute Z1, and for this study, it would be the distance to transit stations. On the y-axis, we have the price of a home. It's important to note that on the x-axis, at point 0, this would be a transit station itself, so that as distance from the transit station increases, the sales price of a house decreases. Then, as we look at the curves in this model, in the middle we have the hedonic pricing schedule, which is the minimum price a consumer must pay to enter the market. And below that we have the consumer curves. Each of these curves holds a different level of attribute Z1, so distance to transit station. So, and where the consumer curves are falling tangent to the hedonic pricing schedule is a point at which the consumer is maximizing their utility or happiness. Then on the opposite side we have the producer curves, which, like the consumer curves, hold a different level of transit proximity. And where all these curves are falling tangent to one another is where a transaction is occurring. And as we can see, consumer number 1 is paying less for a house, however they are located further from transit stations. So then, sorry, usually sometimes this happens, but the independent variables didn't really show up. But again, they're ordered from B1 down to B8 in order, so I'll kind of explain this. The dependent variable is the log of sales price, and we'd expect the sales price to have diminishing returns to the different attributes of a home. So that's why the natural log is taken. Then beta 1, we'd expect this to have a negative sign, and this is due to Alonzo's theory, where as distance increases from a transit station, the value of a house would be expected to decrease. Then we have attributes to account for the home itself, house size, bedrooms, bathrooms. We'd all expect this to have a positive impact on the sales price of a house. And then we have the house age, which we'd expect to have a quadratic relationship, so that initially as a home ages, things like depreciation ultimately decrease the value of a home. But once a home starts to reach a certain age, things like the architecture and the overall building structure are ultimately starting to increase the value of a house. And then we have 2 more variables to really account for, to really control for the distance to transit stations. We have a summer dummy variable, which accounts for a sale during the months from March to the end of September. And this is kind of just to control for seasonality in the housing market. And then we have the neighborhood livability, which uses an index for the neighborhoods to control for like the quality of living. So it includes factors like the crime rates, the educational opportunities in an area. And again, we'd expect this to have a positive sign. As the quality of living increases, we'd expect the sales price of a home to increase. So then kind of getting into the data, I used 3 primary sources: the Minneapolis Assessor's Office, Minneapolis GIS Parcel Maps, and Area Vibes. Area Vibes was used to get the livability indexes to kind of control for the neighborhood indicators, and I kind of explained what factors are taken into account. Then the Minneapolis Assessor's Office, that allowed me to gather the housing sales data, and I gathered sales from 8 different neighborhoods surrounding 5 stations on the Metro Blue Line for the years 2015 and 2016. And the variables that were include sales price, factors of the home, so bedrooms, bathrooms, building area, as well as house age. And then we had to omit about 49 variables due to incomplete data, and another 2 variables as the sales price of house didn't truly reflect the market value of the home. And then finally, the Minneapolis GIS parcel maps allowed me to calculate the air distances from a housing parcel to the closest transit station. And this is done with the help of Professor Jean Levine of Environmental Studies, who's kind of a GIS specialist. And as you can see from the summary statistics, that the minimum distance to a transit station from a house was about 0.02 miles away, and the maximum was about 1.3 miles away. So then kind of getting into the results for this hedonic regression. Starting with the S statistic at the bottom, if it is 0, this would mean that the model is significant at all conventional levels. And then as we move to the R-squared and adjusted R-squared, this is about 56%, which leaves about 44% of the variation of the log of sales price unaccounted for. Then kind of moving on to the independent variables, we first start by looking at the p-values, and you can see that all the variables are significant at the 1% level. And one of these variables is the variable of concern, which is the log of distance to transit stations. And we can see that it is positive, which means that we would reject the hypothesis that proximity to the Metro Blue Line stations positively affects the housing values. And the coefficient of 0.0642 would tell us that a 1% increase in the distance to transit stations would increase the sales price of a house by 0.0642%. The other variables in the study were predicted correctly, aside from the summer variable. So the variables that really account for the house size, bedrooms, bathrooms, house age, these all positively affected the sales price of a home. The summer variable means, as it is negative, it means that a sale during the months from March to the end of September negatively affected the sales price of a home. And then the neighborhood livability index, again, so the quality of living, as this is positive, this again positively affected the sales price of a house. So then kind of getting into the counterfactual analysis, this sort of the economic significance of the study. On the x-axis, we have the distance from light rail transit stations in miles, and on the y-axis, we have the sales price of a house. This was done using the average home, which sits at the middle spot. So this average home costs about $217,000 and is located at a distance of 0.46 miles from the closest transit station. And movements along the x-axis account for 10% increases or decreases in transit stations, or distance to transit stations. So a movement from 0.46 to 0.5, this is roughly about a 10% increase in the distance to a transit station. And like the results show, as distance increases from transit stations, the sales price of a house increases. But it's important to note that there are decreasing marginal returns, so that as distance increases, the house price increases, but at a decreasing rate. So then kind of getting into the conclusions, again, we would reject the findings state that we would reject the hypothesis that distances closer to transit stations increase the value of single-family houses surrounding the Metro Blue Line in Minneapolis. However, we were skeptical to begin with, as Hearst and West did not find significant changes in development since the Metro Blue Line's construction. So Alonzo's theory that land values change prior to changes in development kind of shows that just the demand for these locations wasn't there to begin with. And this could largely be due to Highway 55. So of the 5 transit stations that I observed, they all sit adjacent to Highway 55. And in a study that I had looked at in Washington, they analyzed the effect of housing prices or analyzed the effect that proximity to a highway has on housing prices, and they ultimately found a negative effect due to the stigma for living close to the highway or just noise in general. And one way to possibly control for this effect in the future would be to look at the before and after effects of the highway or of the transit station. So since the highway had been there before the light rail's construction, by analyzing how sales prices of homes have changed since, or when you compare how house prices have changed before and after, we might find different results than simply looking at how distance is affected, or distance from transit station affects the sales price of a home. And then finally, getting into the business and policy implications. So developers, planners, and policymakers should kind of be aware of how home values are affected by different elements within proximity to just kind of understand the demand for these locations. So this study kind of showed that the demand for living close to train stations located on Highway 55 just isn't there. So planners and policymakers trying to maybe gentrify locations along this highway may have difficult times and ultimately be wasting time and money trying to develop something where people don't naturally want to live. So that was kind of the conclusion of my presentation, and I'll be opening up for questions now.
You know, you mentioned that it might be useful to check values prior to the introduction of the blue line.
Mm-hmm.
Is the data there to do that?
That's what I originally wanted to do, but the data wasn't there.
Wasn't there.
At least for the Minneapolis Assessor's Office. But I could have probably went through Zillow, but that would have taken
A long time.
a lot more time.
Yeah. Okay.
In that one index variable, the livability, did you say that that includes income or not?
It included things like just the house, like the affordability of a neighborhood, which kind of includes income, but it didn't include income itself. Okay.
Thanks, Hank.
Thank you all.